Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Nat Turney, with my brother John. And you might be asking yourself right now, why am I talking in this strange radio announcer voice?
And so damn loud.
I'm not loud, dude. What the hell? Why are you always on? John, Jesus, why are you always picking on me? All right, fine. I'll move away from maybe it was because I was doing that stupid voice. I got really close to the microphone. I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. This is not church, though. Thank God, or we'd all be in trouble of some sort of eternal hell for the shenanigans that we pull. But again, my brother John is here. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
Hi, John. All right, we got to sneak that into at least one episode, or once every episode. But we're here today with our friend Brandon Dragan. Let me read you a little bit of something. But we've actually had him on the show before, but he was part of a group of folks who had contributed to Before You Lose Your Mind, right? Because I know we've chatted before, but
yeah,
this
that's
is the first time
I was on with I was on with Matthew DeStefano.
Right. Those other guy, that other guy. Okay, so this is the first time we've had Brandon on by himself. Yeah, it's great if I just talk shit about Matt. He likes that. He enjoys if he comes up at least once or twice in a conversation. So if we say,
is there any other way to talk about Matt?
No, there's no other way.
Not really. No.
Pretty much anytime you talk about Matt, you're talking shit. So that's just the way it rolls. Let me read this real quick before I completely lose the plot here. So Brandon Dragan earned his JD from Belmont University College of Law in Nashville. So whoop whoop for the lawyers. He won the American Bar Association Journal's 2021 Ross Writing Contest. He draws on a wide range of influences from literature to history to philosophy to craft meaningful and often surprising narratives that challenge the status quo and reach for a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. Brandon and his wife Jami live in the Nashville area with their two daughters, Natalie and Brooklyn. He enjoys a good cigar, Irish whiskey, road cycling, and is an avid supporter of Arsenal Football Club. Well, up until that last bit, I was tracking with you, but really, Arsenal?
Oh, come on now.
I say that like I know a damn thing about soccer. I don't know.
My knowledge of soccer ends in like the 6th grade, where I was literally cut from the soccer team. I didn't even know that was possible.
The soccer team that everyone gets to play on?
Yeah, I didn't even know it was possible to get cut from a soccer team in the 6th grade. So you're talking to someone who's like apparently super athletic.
Yeah, the one guy did not get a participation trophy.
And I've been upset ever since. It's a sad state of affairs.
I know enough about soccer to know that when I see the words football club related to a team name, okay, that's not, it's European football. And that's pretty much where it begins and ends. It's proper football, as opposed to whatever bastardized version we play here in the Americas. But aside from all that, welcome to the show, man. We're glad you're here, bud.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on very much.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things that immediately jump out to me. That one of the reasons that we like having you on the show is that you're unique in some sense, and that most of the people that we talk to who are writers, they're writing theological works, they're writing scholarly works, they're writing nonfiction, and you're one of the few who we've had on once or twice that actually work in this field of fiction. And I think that's awesome. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just jump off and tell us a little bit about how those worlds sometimes kind of can kind of cross with one another.
Yeah, definitely. I have always had a bit of a creative bug. I mean, ever since I was a kid, there's a story that my mom tells about my 4th grade teacher at a parent-teacher conference who said that, she gave the class a writing assignment, and most of the kids would come up to her desk and ask, they'd have a few sentences or a paragraph written, and they would say, is this enough? Have I written enough? And she said that I would come to the desk and ask for more paper.
Right.
So, I've always kind of had that. I was never really disciplined enough to write something long form. And so in my teenage years, and it was kind of how I ended up in Nashville, I wanted to be a songwriter. And so I was really high on music, writing a lot of songs. Never really did anything notable as far as that. But it was kind of after I realized I didn't want to be in the music industry and had gotten married and was working full-time jobs and everything that I started writing again. And it was actually really the first thing that I sat down to write was what ended up being my debut novel, The Wages of Grace. And I gave up on it so many times because such a daunting task writing, 115,000 word novel as opposed to a 3-minute song.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
There was just something that kept telling me like, hey, even if nobody reads this, it's worth finishing. It's a story worth telling. And I learned from an early age. I had a few really good high school English teachers and then a couple in college and my undergrad that really motivated me to write. And kind of where those two worlds meet for me is the realization that artists don't create in a vacuum. And so I'm never sitting down to just say, oh, hey, here's an interesting story. Like it's always something that comes out of my heart and it's always something that comes from where I am on my journey. And so, The Wages of Grace was kind of a story as I was exiting evangelicalism, which was a pretty slow journey for me. But that was really a story just about what's the worst thing that a person could do and is forgiveness still available? And so that was kind of on my journey as far as accepting like where I'm at now is more of a universalist perspective. And really that idea that like, there's nothing that a person could do that puts them beyond the reach of forgiveness or love. And so, and then recently I published a short story, before I was with Quoir, just self-published, called Camino Real. And that one is really kind of almost a parable of my own spiritual journey and some of the hardships that I endured. I mean, I put the character in the story through a hell of a lot worse physically and such, but just the realization at the end of the day that I was trying to please this cosmic Pharisee, and that cosmic Pharisee will always be unpleasable. And so it was just the story of me letting that God go, and embracing the God that loves and forgives because that's who he is. And then I had another story that I put out that was called Cast No Shadow. That is the story of a military veteran who, he's this great guy. He's a husband. He's a father. He helps the people in his neighborhood, donates money, does all sorts of good work, and is this, very well-respected person, in the daylight hours. And then at night, he and his band of, guys that he was in the army with, they go and hunt drug gangs. And it really it was just a story of kind of the questioning of these ideas of just violence and what happens when we allow violence to corrode our souls and we end up passing that on to generation after generation. And so again, these were just all things that I was learning about in my own journey that I was working through, and they work themselves into story. And then the most two kind of recent stories that I've output were both kind of wrapped in the world of legal fiction to an extent. So that's kind of where I'm at, and that's just where the worlds meld. Sometimes I'll get an idea for a story, and then it's not until I'm a third or half of the way in that I'm like, oh, this is the story I'm telling. And it's about something that I'm learning, or something that I'm wrestling with. So,
yeah,
I find that that's something and fiction writing, not, and obviously not everyone writes their fiction like this, right? But, I hear this a lot, specifically in fiction, where, the writer, the author is sometimes as surprised at where the story goes as we are when we get to read it. They're like, when I was writing it, I had no idea that's where this was going.
Yeah.
Characters, I can't think of any author off the top of my head right now, but you have authors who's like, I didn't realize I was going to have to kill that character off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I was going to kill that character off and I decided, or I realized that that's not the story.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how that works within fiction. It's really interesting.
And it's weird for me too, because like my wife has asked me about this too, like, but like, I don't really see, I don't have a lot of descriptions of my characters. I try to throw in some guiding, but like, I don't see like faces when I write. You know, some people do. Some people, they see like actors that they've cast in their mind as a particular role or something like that. I don't really, but one of the things that was really influential for me was, and I forget what book it's in, but I think it's Donald Miller that talks about, like, don't judge your characters.
Yeah.
And that was really important for me because, you know, early on you see characters, or, you know, when you're drafting, when you're going through those things, doing things that you didn't expect or doing things that you don't like. But then it's like, okay, they're just working themselves out on page. And I don't really know where that comes from. But it's, 9 times out of 10, it's like that was the way it was supposed to be, not what I had in mind originally. And the really scary thing is sometimes I end up, the characters that I really like are not the ones that I end up identifying with by the end of it. And sometimes the really ugly things are the things I end up identifying with. And I'm like, ooh, I see that. I see me on the page. And that's not, you know, that's not how I want to be, or that's not how I see myself. But then it's like, you know, then it comes around and you're like, oh, that's where that came from, you know? But yeah, I try to be really honest with my work. I just try to be true to myself and, you know, like you mentioned, try to kind of true to the characters and true to where this ends up. And most of the time I have an idea, you know, sometimes it's kind of a rough idea. Most of the struggle for me is like how to connect the dots between where it starts and where it ends, because, you know, you can do that in a really superfluous way. Like, I hate movies where it's just like this great concept and then they scatter some stuff in there that like came out of nowhere and all of a sudden you have a resolution. Like, I just hate that kind of stuff. So for me, like, you know, being honest and real about like how these things might actually happen in the real world has always been important. So
yeah, I always find myself drawn to either, you know, movies or books or things of that nature where the characters are way more complex, right? And one of those things that I think that is interesting between what I would call Christian fiction and fiction that might be written by a Christian is how heavy-handed people are with that process, right? It's almost like some of these folks sat down to write a piece of Christian fiction and then everything got woven around that tale versus just telling their story and letting whatever gospel message is there. I think that's sometimes the difference between, say, I think C.S. Lewis is a little heavy-handed at times in the Narnia books, and Tolkien denies flatly that there's anything allegorical, even though you can see the parallels, right? And I'm way more interested in Tolkien's work than Lewis's, although they're both fine. But do you find yourself drawn to more just tell a story? And then, you know, if there are parallels drawn by people, so be it, but that might not have necessarily been your intention.
Yeah, no, I'm firmly of the belief, like I'm a huge Oasis fan, the band.
Oh yeah.
And, Noel Gallagher, the main songwriter in that band. And, you know, he's a living legend, but like he refuses to talk about what his work means. Like if you ask him, what does this song mean? He's just like, what does it mean to you? Because that's really all that matters. You know, I can put out on the page what comes out of my heart, but what somebody takes away from it is what matters to them. And so, I don't know that I ever sit down and say like, I want to write about this topic, or like I said, it mostly comes from like whatever I'm wrestling with, in my own life. And it does often take like a spiritual perspective for me. I mean, the novella that came out in March of this year, The Resurrection of Jesse Barrow, that has a lot of, I wouldn't call it a work of like a legal fiction work, but I weaved a lot into that because I learned a lot of things about the country that I was told that I lived in growing up, in law school, and, you know, and how a lot of the constitutional rights that, you know, we pride ourselves on as Americans and that kind of thing, like they're fairly modern inventions, by progressive judges who read things into the Constitution that are not plainly there. Doesn't mean they were wrong. In fact, I think in many cases they got it right. But, you know, But then with that story, I had kind of set out with some of that in mind. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about it. So it's called The Resurrection of Jesse Barrow. It takes place in like the deep south of Alabama in the early 1900s. And so my idea was kind of to poke at, this person that gets arrested and, all of the rights that he would not have had in 1911 that we have now. Like, for instance, the right to access counsel in a state proceeding. That didn't exist in 1911. The right not to be beaten into a confession did not exist in 1911. And so like, that's what I was really aiming at. And what ended up happening was, I had an opportunity to talk about race, which I've been really hesitant to do because I don't just want to be another white guy talking about race. And so, that was really what became a little bit of a challenge for me. And so kind of how it ended up working out was, it was again, a little bit of a parallel to my own, like waking up to, I was raised, fairly in a kind of conservative bubble in northeastern New Jersey, and was kind of raised to believe that like issues of race were not that important. If we stopped talking about race, these issues would go away, those kinds of things. And like, in the last 10 years or so, I've really woken up to the fact that like, oh wow, like this goes way deeper than I knew. And I'm really pretty ignorant on this topic. And so I think the resurrection of Jesse Barrow in a lot of ways is kind of, it's kind of analogous to my own waking up to, there's a lot more here that's not as simple as I was led to believe.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because I was trying to find a way to articulate kind of the way that John and I were both raised to talk about race, which was exactly what you just said. Like, listen, if we just stop talking about it, it'll all go away, right? We're making it worse by talking about it.
Which in essence is such a cop-out, because it's basically like, if white people can hear about it less, we'll all feel much better about ourselves.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't think of a better definition of white privilege of being able to say, I'm just not going to talk about this anymore because it does not directly affect me. And therefore I have the option to go, And as long as I can bury my head in the sand, it's okay. But when you talk about issues of the law in particular, I think that's one place that we've had folks on who've talked about, criminal justice reform, these ideals of equal access, equal representation, that I think there's a lot of people in the United States who think that's the norm. And the fact of the matter seems to be that justice is not equal. Punishment's not certainly uniformly applied. There's all kinds of inequalities and inequities in our criminal justice system that seem to criminalize people in the BIPOC community at a much higher level than folks like us. So that's something that you kind of tackle a little bit in some of this book a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, just, the main character, and just to kind of give you a little background in the story, which it was actually, I took a class, my last year in law school that was just wrongful convictions. And it was, kind of a, scholarly look at like what causes wrongful convictions, what are the factors that lead to them and such. And then like, how do we begin to tackle that issue? And, the very first day, Professor Torrey Johnson, at Belmont College of Law, one of my favorite professors, he told us about the very first exoneration that ever happened in the United States. It was in, I think, 1812, and it was a pair of brothers in Vermont who absolutely hated their brother-in-law. One day the brother-in-law goes missing. Like a year later, somebody in the town has a dream that he's buried underneath the brothers' house, the brothers who hated him. And so apparently in 1812, this is how you got a search warrant. Somebody just dreamed something. And so anyway, the two brothers, are convicted, of this crime. And, so anyway, there's a twist at the end of the real story that if I told you, it would probably ruin my story. So my story was kind of based loosely on that. I moved the time frame up to little bit more modern times. But yeah, I do, in a sense, deal with the main character gets arrested for the murder of the mayor in town. And the main character is a white guy who just grew up dirt poor and he can't afford an attorney. And, and at that time, until you went to trial in state court, you were not guaranteed, and particularly for a capital offense, like you weren't guaranteed counsel until you got to trial. And so all throughout interrogations, all through, this waiting period, like if you couldn't afford an attorney, you were just out of luck.
Wow.
And one of the things that you still see in today's system that's so disheartening, because like you said, well, it's a particular line that you see where like poverty is punished is with bail. The way that system is set up, if you're accused of a crime, and your bond is set at $100,000 or even $10,000, and you can't afford that, what ends up happening is people plead guilty to crimes that they didn't commit, crimes that they should really defend at trial, just because they can't sit in jail for 4 or 6 months awaiting trial because they're going to lose their job. They're going to lose their apartment. They're going to lose their family. And so people end up just taking pleas just to get out of jail. And one of the things that kind of fires me up too is like, a lot of people don't realize the amount of collateral consequences that attach with a conviction. I mean, you can't vote, you can't own a firearm, you can't, there's employment consequences. There's literally thousands and thousands of collateral consequences that attach as soon as you plead guilty, even if it's to a crime you didn't commit, and you only plead guilty so you can get out of jail. So it is a system. And in the United States, I think in state court, it's like 92% of cases are resolved on plea bargains. It's even higher in the federal system. And so it's just this like churn them in, churn them out system where, like people's humanity gets lost. And additionally, if you have the money to bail out, you go home and you can defend yourself. If you have the ability to hire an attorney and take it to trial, that's a totally different situation.
Yeah. The inequity is it's pretty stark, and never mind, then you get into issues also of how people are charged. And I know that was a big issue, especially it still is, but I remember first hearing about it in the 80s when white guys would get caught with cocaine and a black guy gets caught with crack, and they get sentenced very differently. Suddenly the white, the lawyer with a gram of coke is going, to community service, and the guy with a rock of crack is going to do hard time. And so we have jails filled with people on petty drug offenses. And then you can go further and talk about the corporatization of prisons in America and find out that there's all kinds of financial incentive to overcharge, to give people the maximum sentences and keep them incarcerated inside a system. But yeah, there's a ton there. It sparked something for me anyway. When you talk about, we did briefly offline before we started, the concept of restorative justice versus punitive justice. How do those roads intersect then too? Because I know inside of our legal system, it seems very few people are interested in any kind of restorative justice. It all seems to be punitive.
Yeah, and I think the major misunderstanding there, or the major issue that why people are so reserved about the idea of restorative justice is a misunderstanding of what restorative justice is. Because when a lot of people hear that, they just assume like, oh, you're going to send the guilty guy to counseling, or you're going to send him to rehab or whatever, and he's not going to be punished, or he's not going to, when the concept is actually much more focused on how do we do better for victims of crime?
Right.
And so I actually, in the Resurrection of Jesse Barrow, which is actually a collection of some of my works, I've got my essay from my law school sentencing law class. In law school, they call it a rigorous writing requirement, and it was rigorous. But I wrote mine on restorative justice. And part of what what's important to me is, not only do we have a problem with offenders, we also have a problem with the way that victims are treated in the system. Because, if you think about it, if you're a victim of a violent crime, for instance, you get out of your car, to go to work in the parking lot and you're violently assaulted by somebody, the first time we hear from you is when we put you on the stand to tell your story. So you have to sit there in court facing the person that did this to you. You have to tell your story. You're answering honestly, like all these things that happened to you. You're having to dig this trauma up again. And then a good defense attorney gets up there next, and his job, which this is nothing against defense attorneys. I hope to be one 6 months from now when I pass the bar. But a good defense attorney, his job is to make you sound not credible. Like to make the people in the courtroom think, no, this didn't happen to you, or it didn't happen like you said it did, or, whatever. And so like we re-traumatize victims, in this whole process. And then, at the end of the day, there's no other steps for the victims. It's like, tell your story, get beaten up, and then that's it. And what's even worse is for a lot of people, like for instance, this example, you get really beaten, outside of your workplace or whatever. You spend 3 months in the hospital, and then the guy pleads guilty to a simple assault and he's back on the street, practically before you're out of the hospital. Like there's no justice in that for the victim either. And so the concept of restorative justice is to put the humanity back in the system. To number one, like allow victims to tell us what justice looks like. And then kind of as a community to have a situation where we can put our arms around them and like walk them through some sort of healing. There's no set definition of what restorative justice is, but there are loads of practices that are being used in countries around the world. And a lot of it is like a learning experience as we come, but there's a lot of evidence that the victims who participate in restorative justice programs, they feel less victimized. They feel less afraid of the person that hurt them. They feel like there's more closure than those that just go through the criminal justice system. And it's because in restorative programs, we really give the victims an opportunity to have their voice heard, to like I said, tell us what you need. Tell us what healing looks like. And sometimes one of the things that I really like, one of the programs, is like a surrogate meeting where, for instance, if you had your purse snatched from you on the street, you might meet with somebody, not the guy who did it to you necessarily, but somebody else who took somebody's purse. And you get to tell that person, this is how it felt when it happened to me. And that person gets to connect the consequences of their actions with a real human being. They get to hear about how somebody felt violated. They get to hear about the pain somebody went through. And so it has the potential to like alter their course. And at the same time, that surrogate offender gets to talk about their life, about like, this is how I was raised, where, I didn't have an education. These things happened to me. And so for the victim, it allows them to feel like, oh, I'm not just the victim of some random, assault or theft or whatever. Like there were reasons this person felt like they had to do this. And so I think it does offer a lot of opportunity for healing on both parts. And it, the programs that I have read about that I really think that we should look into much more seriously in the United States, they're completely voluntary. They're still under the supervision of the court. And so like, we're not forcing anybody to forgive. Forgiveness doesn't even come into the equation. Like we're not asking victims to forgive, but what I like, Howard Zehr, who is kind of known as the father of restorative justice in this setting, talks about how restorative justice can create the atmosphere where forgiveness can happen. And again, it's if we want it to.
It piques my interest in many ways. Part of that goes back to what you talked about with your work, Wages of Grace. When you talk about, is there a scenario where we consider that people are beyond the reach,
right,
of being fixed or forgiven or restored in some way? And it reminded me of Capen's book, I think it's between noon and 3, where he tells an extended parable of a person who is actively involved in an adulterous affair, and they're confessing this crime to this priest who's not immediately telling them, stop the affair, do this. He's taking a very hands-off approach to like, well, let's talk this out. And so it immediately takes away that knee-jerk reaction of casting judgment on someone's actions, trying to paint everything in very broad strokes. And that's what it sounds like. That's the difficult part, isn't it? Because the place we always want to go is that there's somebody who's right and there's somebody who's wrong. And I'm saying all of this because to me, this is the beauty of good fiction. Is it brings you into complex characters. It brings you to a place where people aren't just completely great or completely horrifying. You find yourself sympathizing with people who are less than sympathetic, just because you find there's layers to their character that don't just fit. So I love that, and that's why I think the stuff that you're writing and things like that are important for us, because they do reveal some more complexity than I think we get a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I'm drawn to those same types of characters too. I mean, one of my favorite TV shows is Breaking Bad. I mean, you look at that situation with Walt, how like you end up really despising him, but at the same time you feel for him. And like, I think you're exactly right. And that's part of what drew me to criminal defense work and to going to law school later in life than a lot of people do, was this idea that everybody's a human being. Even people who have done terrible things are human beings. And it doesn't take, I mean, if you're on a local group on Facebook or something like that, and some crime happens in your area, like, it's always shocking to me to see like people want to bring public hangings back and, lock this guy up and throw, I mean, I remember reading one time about a case in my area where somebody actually said about the defendant in this case that he's not human and he doesn't have the right to breathe our air.
Right.
And, to me, that was shocking, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. I live in the Nashville area, kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt, as you call it. So I guess it makes a bit of sense when you think of it coming from a place of like I've got restorative on my mind, but retributive God, a God who is willing to throw people away, a God who is willing to smite human beings. Like, if that's the God you believe in, then like, yeah, you do throw people away.
Oh yeah. And because you're just, at that point, you're just an extension of the arm of God, right? You're just doing what you perceive God to do. To do any less would be to somehow to fail God in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's nuts.
And it's not to say that people don't deserve punishment. It's not to say people don't deserve incarceration. I think we can do incarceration a lot better. But, it's not to say that like somebody should skate on the consequences of their actions at all. But it is to say that, the person sitting there is still a human being. And, just like I mentioned earlier, an artist doesn't create in a vacuum. Our actions don't happen in a vacuum either.
Right.
And so, exactly. That was kind of, like I said, what drew me to want to do criminal defense work in the first place was, you have a courtroom, you have a town, you have a county, whatever, of people who hate this particular person. I want to be the person that stands in that person's corner.
Mm.
I believe there's something, there's a sacred calling in that. And like, and I, we haven't really gotten into my, my spiritual journey. I mean, I would say I'm an atheist probably 3 days a week. But I'm at the point where like I'm comfortable believing because I choose to believe and not because I'm intellectually convinced of, certain things. But the story of Jesus and the person of Jesus is still very captivating for me. And so my point was just being, I think if you look around the courtroom, and you want to ask where Jesus is, I think he's probably at the defendant's table. Not that he's not concerned with justice, but you don't get a lot of mercy in the system, and you certainly don't get a lot of dignity. And so I think being the person that's able to stand there with that human being as a reminder of this human being's dignity and worth, something I want to give my life to. You guys can check back with me in 10 years and see how that's going.
Yeah. We'll check back with you in 6 months and see how you feel about passing the bar.
Yeah.
You're like, screw this, man. I'll just be a paralegal. Well, that's it. Yeah. It's John, you have a question. I know I just keep talking. So
no, I don't really have a question. I was just more of a comment that, we are told that this country is a Christian nation. And that we are raised on Christian. Yeah, I know. We're raised on Christian values, but we know that this is not necessarily the truth, that this country is not necessarily based on any kind of Christian values. And that, each side can give you quote after quote as to why this is true or not true. But one of the things that just seems so hypocritical, I guess, is that if we are supposedly a Christian nation, which we are following this man called Jesus, who, for all intents and purposes that I can see, is someone who is showing us over and over again a restorative justice, not a punitive justice. That he is dismantling this idea that going after people because of mistakes they made and putting them in whatever prison or putting them to death or whatever, is not the way. But we are so happy to fall right back into this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and forget everything that this man Jesus said, to the point where we are willing to put people to death because, like you said, they're not human. They don't deserve to breathe our air. And it's such a weird dichotomy for me that I can't wrap my head around how easily we've lost our way. If any of that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I think it comes from that certain understanding of God where like God's mercy is at the service of his justice and not the other way around. Yeah. You see, the whole war on drugs, where we really tried to criminalize, essentially we criminalized people who were suffering from addiction, as opposed to like serving those people. And so, like how would Jesus have handled that? Maybe a little bit differently than, just putting you behind bars and locking away the key, and all this to say too, like there are a certain class of people that for whatever reason, psychological, whatever, they're literally just too dangerous to be walking the streets. Like, Ed Kemper, he's still alive, the co-ed killer. Like, please don't let Ed Kemper out. Like, I don't care. Ed Kemper is 6'9". I don't care if he's 80. Please don't let him out, Now, again, that's not to say we can't do incarceration. We can't do punishment better. And I think that may be a little bit of where this kind of heads in this country, because I think that to the like the punishment retribution crowd, I think that's a little bit more palatable than, like a full on right off the bat restorative approach, which again wouldn't work in all situations, wouldn't necessarily happen in all situations. But again, like the idea that we could, because right now, prisons around the country, they're just breeding grounds for criminality. And it's again, it's not necessarily because like people who end up in prison are just people with bad character who are unfixable. It's because like nothing happens in a vacuum. And so when you put somebody in a room with people who are really good at what they do, you're going to learn from that. And then when you get out on the street after who knows how many years, you don't know how to work an iPhone. You don't know how to, there are people that, they've been incarcerated so long that they can't figure out how to fill out a job application because it's online. And so, and then who's gonna, not many places will hire them for a position that they can actually live off of. And so I think that whole, not only is it diametrically opposed to what Jesus taught. I mean, it's in so many ways, it's diametrically opposed to common sense and what works and what doesn't work for a society. But again, I do think there is that element, like we talked about earlier, of like Americans, and I say this because Americans are my people, and I am one, and so that's just when I see things in myself that I think are worthy of criticism. But like white Americans in particular, again, it goes back to like, it's just easier not to think about these people.
Right. Exactly.
It's just easier that they're put away. We're safe from them. I don't have to worry about it in my neighborhood. And we don't think of the ripple effects through my community, through the offender's community, their family, the victim's family. We don't think about that because it's just, It's more convenient and less painful not to, because if we really thought about it, we would have to do something about it.
Right. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, and I think, I can only speak for myself, but I don't have to look back very far into my past to where I had a completely different response to all of this.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I was raised very conservative, in a very white community. So it was super easy for me to say, well, obviously, if they were caught doing a crime and they were put in jail for it and they were found guilty, that they should be punished to the utmost of the law because that's how the system works. And I don't have to go back very far in my own life to say that I agreed with that 100%. But it doesn't take much intellectual honesty to start looking at these cases individually and realizing that there's a lot of nuances to why they were arrested, why they went to court, how the legal system didn't help them through the process. And like you said, their best option is to plead guilty to say maybe and this is in air quotes, a lesser crime so they can get out of jail. But now they're a felon. They can't get a job. They can't vote. They can't own a firearm, which that's a completely different, scenario for me. Second Amendment issues aside. But like you said, then they're going to go out and try to find a job so they can keep their apartment. They can keep their car. They can keep their family together. And none of that works because in some way, shape or form, whoever they're looking to get a job from finds out they're a felon. They're not a very good candidate, right? Again, in quotes, for the job. So they end up going back to what they know how to do, which is take care of them and their family in maybe not the most legal way.
Yeah. And if you think too, just about like employment consequences, for instance, like in a lot of states, if you have a conviction, you can't get a job that requires state licensure. So like you can't be a barber, like we're not talking like, serving on the Supreme Court. It's like, it's meaningful work that people do that you're prevented from by the system of collateral consequences.
Well, yeah. Think of those things you can't do. Like probably can't get a CDL.
Yeah.
So you probably can't drive a truck. You probably can't get, general contractor's license or.
Yeah. You can't be an electrician.
Like all those things you probably like think about. Yeah. All those things that would be like the next step up for somebody who maybe didn't have the opportunity to go to college. You go, but there's, and then we always say this stuff, don't we? Like, man, there are plenty of good paying jobs out there for people who are interested in working in a trade. And then you've taken all of that off the table.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because also a lot of these trade jobs, you have to be bonded, right?
Yeah, bonded, licensed. I mean, you don't get to go, work on someone's plumbing without being a licensed plumber, and you probably don't get into those unions.
I read, and I think I included it in the paper that's in the Resurrection of Jesse Barrow in that collection in Louisiana, that there were inmates, like violent inmates that were basically trained on like HVAC and like air conditioning repair and such. And so like when the air conditioning in the prison went out, they would send the inmates up there to fix it. But if they got out, they couldn't do that job because they had a conviction. So it was like,
wow.
What was the point of all that other than free labor for the prison system, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure it's all operated under the guise of this is now our, because that goes back to the more classic argument of the prison system, which is rehabilitation versus versus punishment. Right. So are we just trying to punish these people, or are we trying to find a way to rehabilitate them? And so we afford them, opportunities to better themselves and go to school and maybe learn a trade. And then when they get out, they find they're still behind that 8 ball of, okay, fine, you know how to do this, but you'll never practice in this until you can get that conviction expunged somehow.
Yeah.
It's frustrating because I've seen movies and I've watched and I've read stories of people who have, they've come out of, especially a longer term incarceration, and just the almost impossible uphill climb. And we haven't even gotten into how people are treated by, say, parole officers and the parole system. I have really good friends of mine who were both at one point, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, they were both very heavily addicted to methamphetamine, and they were manufacturing. And they both got arrested, spent a lot of time in jail, I think 4 or 5 years. And then when they got out, their troubles had just begun, because all of the fines that get assessed have to be paid. That's part of the terms and conditions. So they were paroled, a little early from their sentences, but spent the next several years working 2 and 3 jobs to pay the courts back so that they could fight. Because even if their term had run up, I think if they'd fulfilled their term on their parole, they wouldn't technically be released until they'd paid tens of thousands, maybe even close to $100,000 in fines. So it's a system that I understand. I guess I try to be open-minded and say, I understand the point. But I think people think, let me say the word think one more time. I think people assume that that the threat of a large punishment is enough to disincentivize this, right? This is going to be the thing that warns people off of a life of crime, so to speak. But it doesn't seem to work that way, right? I mean, that's been the argument for the death penalty all these years. It's like, well, if we just all we have to do is start publicly hanging people and people will stop murdering.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think so, man.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's there's kind of a threefold approach to like how, I mean, and I think it works in most, situations, but like from a criminal justice standpoint of like, you have the potential reward. You have to consider the consequences of the action, but then you also have to consider the possibility of being caught. And so, for instance, my final semester, I wrote a piece on white collar crime and why we're seeing such a huge uptick in victimization, for white collar crime. I mean, it was statistic I read that's like 25%, like 1 in 4 American households will be a victim of white collar crime of some kind. And particularly when you're talking about like high level financial frauds, like your Bernie Madoffs and Enrons and all that, we've increased the sentences drastically to where like, if you're convicted, you will serve much more time now than you would have in 1985, for instance, for the same exact crime. However, people don't feel like they're being caught. So you haven't even, when you're talking about, I could potentially have $100 million out of this scheme. If I get caught, I'll serve the rest of my life in prison, no question. But nobody's getting caught, and so that whole part of the equation just drops out. And again, from a I guess sociological point of view, like Americans tend to be much more concerned about feeling safe in their own neighborhood than they do about being the victim of financial fraud, even though white collar crime, I mean, costs hundreds of billions of dollars more than street crime does to the American economy every single year. Most of our resources go to fighting street level crime.
Yeah.
And again, there's a privilege aspect of that too. I mean, part of it has to do with, higher level white collar crime. Those cases are incredibly complex and incredibly expensive to prosecute. But if we're just doing like a cost benefit analysis, it would seem, like keeping the economy from melting down like it did in 2008 might be where we would want to concentrate.
Yeah, but if you cast not too wide a net, though, you get those same guys caught up in it, though, right? I mean, the other side of that coin is that those people who are engaged in that kind of activity, if and when they are caught, they can generally afford better legal counsel.
Absolutely, yeah,
right, and they can probably plea that down to something manageable.
And a lot of times the upper level white collar criminals never actually face anything because, number one, the corporation settles with the Department of Justice, or they just throw lower level employees who are also involved under the bus. And it's kind of a race to the courthouse situation in that regard as far as immunity and that kind of thing. But
it proves the point, though, that so little of this is prosecuted that a name like Bernie Madoff stands out so well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we all know that one because he was one. They made an example of Bernie Madoff, and well, they probably should have. But the reason you can think of one guy is because how many have just sort of slipped through the cracks?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, with the incredible amount of law enforcement resources that we've put towards it. And again, the cost to society and everything. And yet, like, still, I think in the last 20 years, 8 of the 10 biggest Ponzi schemes ever have occurred. And like, who knows how many are out there that haven't been uncovered yet. But that's the thing is like people feel like they can get away with it. And, and I guess that goes into the whole discussion, in a wider, lens is like, you have people who are literally bankrupting companies. They're, stealing your grandma's, pension and social security and, causing huge havoc across, industries. And yet we're stopping and frisking some teenager on the street,
right?
For like literally for no reason. And, we think that's where the priorities should be. So, yeah.
Yeah. And we've left the largest Ponzi scheme in the world alone, which I would say is the church. I mean, I don't mean it to be funny. I do think that there are people in this country operating churches on a criminal level.
Yeah.
Operating under the guise of, spiritual, religious freedom and liberty, who are literally bankrupting families, stealing from their flocks and not being held accountable because, for whatever reason. I mean, they're doing it for the Lord. So
yeah. Oh yeah, then that's okay.
It's voluntarily given. I mean,
that's right. Even if that voluntary status is coerced as hell.
Yeah.
That was meant tongue in cheek, by the way. So under the threat of going to hell, you need to provide me with an income so I can buy a Mercedes. But isn't it interesting too? Because you look at that, what you said about we've thrown so much money at this, right? From illegal, the government has spent lots of money prosecuting these cases and stuff. But haven't we done the same thing with the drug war? I mean, haven't we taken billions and maybe trillions of dollars at this point in resources and leveled them against drug addiction?
Yeah. And that hasn't really worked out well, has it?
Hasn't done a damn thing except destroy lives that were probably, in my estimation, many of them were in the process of being destroyed already. And you've just taken marginalized people and further marginalized them. Yeah,
no, I mean, I've been working, as a law clerk during my time in law school. And I mean, there's people that it's shocking that they made it as far as they did, knowing their background, their childhood and the way that they were brought up. And and it is, like I said earlier, I mean, it's this whole issue of like criminalizing addiction as opposed to actual criminal behavior, and now like we're getting to the point where, you have states like Tennessee that have adopted laws where, like, for instance, and they're with good intentions, they're aimed at, drug dealers. So like, for instance, if you sell somebody drugs that's laced with fentanyl and they overdose, you can be prosecuted for murder. But kind of the unintended consequences is, you're having people who are using drugs and like casually sharing them with friends, those kinds of things. And a friend overdoses, and now that person is charged with murder. Right. And so again, it's like, you're not really going after the people who, or at least the consequences aren't the people who are profiting from the system of feeding addiction. It ends up being the people who are suffering from the addiction that end up in these situations. And I mean, that's one of the things too, with the whole war on drugs. I mean, this is just kind of a theory that I've posited, but like, we as Americans love to talk about economics, and we love to talk about supply and demand. I mean, the issue with drugs coming across our border would not be an issue if there wasn't demand for it. And so like, at some point, if you want to go back, I mean, where did this all really explode? Maybe like the 1960s, if you want to talk about that. Like, what was it about American culture that at the time we were like, we need to forget. We need to blank out and not feel. Like, you think of the night, I mean, especially in conservative circles, like we're taught, the 1950s and 60s are like the golden age of America, where everything was simpler and families were families and men were men and we all went to church. And it's like, yeah, like why were we trying to escape so hard? What was it about the culture at the time that, that set us on this path? And so like, that's why I always just say to people like, usually however well you feel like you've figured an issue out, it's much more complex. And so when you look back at that time period, for instance, yeah, like again, getting to my point now where I think, we're several generations on to these like cycles of addiction. But going back in American history, I mean, you can even go back to like Prohibition, about we were trying to get rid of alcohol because of what it was wreaking on this culture. But like, we never stopped to ask the question, like, why do we have an alcohol problem? And it's the same thing now. I think we have not yet asked the question, like, why do we have a drug problem? And because we haven't wanted to look at ourselves that closely.
Very true.
Well, and I think there's been we have created a monster that now needs to be fed. And so kind of going off of what Nat said, and I was not aware of this. So this is information that I didn't know, that serving time for, say, a crime of manufacturing methamphetamines, at the end of your time that you're in jail, you still owe this fine. I was not aware of that. This is new information to me. So first of all, I would say that the prison leasing system is alive and well in this country. That it has not gone away. And we know exactly who that is directed at. The BIPOC community, who is going to have the hardest time finding any kind of gainful employment outside of when they leave prison. They are put right back into a scenario where they are surrounded by the same shit that caused them to end up in prison for probably a very small crime, like being caught with a small amount of drugs. So now we have a system that says you need to pay us back these tens of thousands of dollars, but we're not going to let you find a job. We're not going to help you find a job. You're going to have to now go back into the system that worked for you. And you're going to end up with some drug lord who's been more than willing to have you sell their drugs, maybe give you a little bit on the side to cover your addiction that probably never went away. And now you, like you said, you end up selling something that's laced with fentanyl. Someone dies. Now you're in prison for murder, and now you're there for the rest of your life on death row. It's just a system that is so broken that who in that community would ever feel like they have a way out? Ever.
It crosses so many lines too, because, you see it in the like poor rural white communities as well.
Yeah.
You see those same cycles. And that's why I said, like, I don't think this country has yet really looked at itself in the mirror. Because I think a lot of where these issues stem from, it has to do with something very, very dark and corroded in our own soul. And because we like to see ourselves as Christian nation, this shining hill, this beacon, shining beacon on the hill or whatever you want to call it. We like to see ourselves as Israel, that, we're the ones we're God's chosen people, that we tend to think we can't have these things or they don't matter anymore. And I don't know that there's anything that can happen but for that to corrode future generations. I mean, the good news is, I'm not a total nihilist. I do think, like, in a lot of senses, we are waking up to some of these problems. I mean, I think you're seeing it in the church or in the exodus from the church. I think that honestly, like Netflix, HBO have had a huge impact. I mean, documentaries like Making a Murderer and The Staircase and, that have like brought some of these things into the popular consciousness, have changed the way that we view the legal system. And hopefully you are seeing, like, for instance, in Philadelphia and some countries around, or some bigger cities around the country, where you are seeing, DAs being elected on platforms of reform, where they're going back, looking at cases where, they knew things weren't right, where there was evidence that wasn't right, where, misconduct took place, whatever it is. And they're actively working to see if, there are exonerations that need to happen. You have the Innocence Project, you have people that are, advocating. And so I do think that will continue to kind of swell. And I think that there is a movement towards, like, looking at ourselves in the mirror and kind of like what I said about the resurrection of Jesse Barrow, that story, just this awakening to, like, this runs a lot deeper and it's much more complex than I realized. And, I really haven't walked in another person's shoes. So maybe instead of plugging my ears, like we talked about earlier, and saying, oh, I wish this would all just go away, maybe I should actually listen and see how I can become an advocate for somebody else if I'm in the position to do so.
That's awesome. And I think a really good way to approach that is like you have done. And because I really think sometimes we assimilate some of this material better in story form. And so, usually if you can find a narrative that's compelling, you can get people to kind of look beyond their own biases and prejudices and see something deeper. Because usually what we get is very black and white, very sort of two-dimensional caricatures of people in the media, especially. And it's easy to paint somebody as just the bad guy and someone is just the good guy, or someone is just the perpetrator and someone else is just the victim. And, that there's layers to all that stuff that's deep. So the new book, I'm ordering it on Amazon right now, by the way.
Well, thank you. So
I'm going to grab that. We don't like to plug Amazon any more than we have to, but there it is.
You can go to your local bookstore and ask for it. They should be able to order it.
I live in a literary wasteland. It's unlike anything. Now, if you live in a town or a municipality or a village or something with a borough, with a decent local bookstore, by all means, man, go patronize those stores. But all things being equal, if you just want to get a hold of it, it's available all kinds of other places as well. And I think it's an exciting thing that like I said, you're one of only a couple folks that we've had on the podcast who this is the medium you work in is fiction. And I think it's an interesting tool to explore some of these issues in a little more in-depth way than sometimes just a scholarly work or a piece of nonfiction. So I think it's great, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to have been here, and I try to write fiction that I would want to read as well. So I get bored easily. So hopefully my books don't do that to people, but I try to keep the pace pretty well, and hopefully keep you guessing a little bit too. So
that's awesome, man. Well, we appreciate you coming out. Thanks for being on the podcast. Make sure and check out all of Brandon's stuff on all the interwebs and all the social medias. And that sounds great, doesn't it, John? I'm going to pour myself a glass of Irish whiskey and see if I can't see the rest of this day. Actually, I'll show you some of the new whiskey I just came home with. Woo! It's not Irish, but it's good stuff. But anyway, man, just thanks for hanging out. We appreciate it. You are the bomb.
Absolutely. Thank you guys. Appreciate you having me.
That's just that's a terrible ending. And you're the bomb. Thanks, John. And we're out.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.